8 German soldiers surrounded a man who could barely stand on his feet. Dirty, emaciated, weaponless. The perfect target for entertainment before lunch. The patrol was returning to base after a routine sector sweep and stumbled upon a vagrant in tatters of Soviet uniform who wasn't even trying to run. Outwardly, this was too easy prey for Wehrmacht soldiers confident in their superiority. But they didn't know that before them stood Captain Vlasik, a man whose hands were stronger and more painful than any weapon in their arsenal. The autumn of 1941 had turned the western regions of the Soviet Union into a giant cauldron where hundreds of thousands of Red Army soldiers found themselves cut off from their units. The forests of the Smolensk region became the last refuge for those trying to break through eastward to their lines. German patrols methodically combed through every square kilometer, hunting for stragglers, wounded, and deserters. Each captured Russian meant one less enemy, one less potential threat to Wehrmacht rear communications. The patrol sergeant assessed the prisoner with the professional contempt of a hunter for cornered prey. Before them stood practically a skeleton wrapped in skin, a man who obviously hadn't eaten for several days, maybe a week. Stubble covered sunken cheeks, eyes had retreated deep into their sockets. The uniform hung on his shoulders like on a coat hanger. No insignia, no documents, no signs that this man had once been a combat-ready soldier of the Red Army. Just another of thousands of Russians who wandered through the forests, hoping to survive. The Germans talked among themselves, discussing their find. Someone suggested carrying out the sentence here and now, not wasting time. Another chuckled, watching the prisoner sway in place. He couldn't even stand straight. A third pulled out a flask and demonstratively took a sip, watching for a reaction. This was a familiar game for soldiers who had been at the front for months. A little entertainment before executing the order to destroy prisoners of war found outside camps. They pushed him with rifle butts, laughed when he stumbled. One of the soldiers imitated a fighting stance, showing his comrades how Russians supposedly fight. Clumsy, slow, helpless. The rest roared with laughter, picking up the joke. The sergeant ordered the prisoner taken to the nearest tree, standard procedure before execution, so they wouldn't have to drag him far for burial afterward. These few minutes of mockery were the last human weakness that Wehrmacht soldiers allowed themselves before performing their duty. The prisoner remained silent, didn't beg for mercy, didn't try to explain himself in broken German, didn't fall to his knees with pleas for life. He just stood, swaying slightly, and looked somewhere to the side. The Germans took this for shock or complete indifference of a man who had already resigned himself to his fate. Exhaustion, hunger, cold. All this turned people into spineless beings, incapable even of elementary resistance. They had seen hundreds like this during the last months of war. But behind this mask of exhaustion and submission worked the mind of a professional fighter who assessed the situation with the cold precision of a mechanism. 8 opponents. 3 on the right, 2 on the left, 3 more behind and on the sides. All armed with Mauser 98 rifles, the sergeant had a Walther pistol on his belt. Distance to the nearest, 1.5 meters, to the farthest, 4 meters. Trees around created natural obstacles for shooting. Visibility limited by dense undergrowth. Time of day, second half of the afternoon. Sun on the left beats into the eyes of those standing facing west. Vlasik counted seconds. Every cell of his body, despite hunger and fatigue, remembered thousands of hours of training. The Lesgaft Institute of Physical Culture in Leningrad. Special NKVD courses, practical sessions with instructors from Japan and China studying Eastern martial arts. Hand-to-hand combat for him wasn't a set of techniques. It was a philosophy of survival, where every movement was calculated for maximum efficiency with minimum energy expenditure. You could take down an opponent in hundreds of ways, but you could only survive yourself by choosing the right sequence of actions. Years of work as an instructor in state security agencies taught him the main rule of hand-to-hand combat. Act at the moment when the enemy is maximally relaxed and confident in his superiority. The Germans had already mentally finished this story, already imagined how they would return to base and tell about another captured Russian. Their fingers didn't lie on triggers. Rifle barrels pointed to the sides or down. The most dangerous moment for any soldier. The seconds between decision and action itself. The sergeant waved his hand to one of the soldiers, ordering him to place the prisoner against a tree. The young corporal stepped forward, extending his hand to push the Russian in the right direction. This was a mistake. The last mistake of his life. Because the man before him wasn't a helpless victim. He was a weapon loaded with years of training and tempered by the will to survive. Captain Vlasik, hand-to-hand combat instructor of the People's Commissariat of Internal Affairs, a man who trained elite units in the art of silent elimination of the enemy. A final thought flashed through Vlasik's mind before action. If he died here, no one would ever know what happened in this forest. But if he survived, these 8 Germans would become the first in a long list of enemies who underestimated a Soviet soldier, not because he was stronger or faster, but because he was taught to turn weakness into a weapon, to use the enemy's strength against himself, to find vulnerable points where others saw only the enemy's superiority. And now, the moment had come. If you find this story about incredible strength of spirit and mastery that can turn any situation around captivating, then be sure to subscribe to the channel and leave a comment below. Share your opinion. Did you know about such episodes of the war? Ahead awaits a story of a fight that will become legendary. The path of Nikolai Vlasik to that autumn day in the forest began 10 years before the war. The young corporal extended his hand, fingers almost touching the prisoner's shoulder. In that fraction of a second, the entire world compressed into a single point of absolute clarity. Vlasik's mind, operating with machine-like precision despite exhaustion, calculated distances, angles, trajectories. The corporal's hand hung in the air, vulnerable, exposed, defenseless. His body weight shifted forward, balance disrupted. His comrades stood relaxed, their attention wandering, rifles pointing at the ground. The sergeant had already turned his head, saying something to the soldier on his left. Perfect. Vlasik's hands moved faster than conscious thought could follow. Years of drilling the same movements thousands of times until muscle memory replaced deliberation. His right hand shot up, fingers closing around the corporal's wrist in a grip that combined 3 different martial arts techniques into one devastating hold. The wrist bent backward at an impossible angle. Vlasik heard the small bones crack. Simultaneously, his left elbow drove upward into the corporal's throat with surgical precision. The larynx collapsed. Cartilage shattered. The corporal's eyes widened in shock and agony, but no sound emerged from his destroyed windpipe. He couldn't scream, couldn't warn his comrades, couldn't even gasp for air. Vlasik caught the falling body, using it as a shield, spinning to face the others. All of this happened in less than 2 seconds. The other Germans were still processing what their eyes had just witnessed. Their brains struggled to reconcile the image of the helpless prisoner with the explosion of violence that had just erupted before them. The path to this moment had begun in Leningrad. 1931. The Institute of Physical Culture, named after Lesgaft, stood as a temple of Soviet athletic achievement. But in its basement corridors, something far more dangerous was being forged. The Soviet Union was preparing for inevitable war with the capitalist world. and the security organs had received orders to create a new generation of fighters. Men who could operate alone or in small groups, possessing skills that transformed an ordinary human being into a particularly dangerous weapon. Vlasik had entered the instructor training program almost by accident. A young border guard officer who had distinguished himself in several skirmishes with Basmachi rebels in Central Asia, he had attracted the attention of an NKVD commission with his ability to make rapid decisions in critical situations. His physical data were average. Height, 1 meter 75 centimeters, weight, 72 kilograms. No outstanding indicators of strength or speed. But his psychological profile showed a rare combination of qualities. Cold calculation combined with readiness for instant action. Absence of fear of death while maintaining self-preservation instinct. The instructors were legends. Senior Lieutenant Viktor Spiridonov, creator of the weaponless self-defense system for the Red Army, a man who had studied martial arts in China and Japan even before the revolution. Captain Vasily Oshepkov, judo master who had received his black belt in Japan itself. The only European admitted to the secrets of the Kodokan school. Colonel Anatoly Kharlampiev, wrestling theorist who developed the scientific foundation for every technique, every movement. They didn't simply teach fighting, they created a new science. A system where Eastern philosophy merged with Western biomechanics, where ancient techniques were tested against modern combat realities. They analyzed every bone, every nerve cluster, every pressure point on the human body. They studied how pain worked, how consciousness shut down, how death arrived when specific anatomical structures were damaged in specific ways. Vlasik absorbed everything like a sponge. He trained 6 hours daily, 7 days a week, for 3 years. His hands became instruments of precise destruction. His mind learned to read opponents like open books, anticipating movements before they happened. He studied not just how to strike, but where, when, and why. The difference between a broken rib and a punctured lung was 2 centimeters. The difference between unconsciousness and death was 3 seconds of pressure. The philosophy they taught went beyond mere technique. Survival wasn't about being the strongest or fastest. It was about being the smartest, the most adaptable, the most ruthlessly efficient. Turn the enemy's strength into weakness. Use their confidence as a weapon against them. Strike not where they expect, but where they cannot defend. Every advantage could be manufactured from apparent disadvantage. Exhaustion could be feigned. Weakness could be performed. Helplessness could be the deadliest trap. By 1934, Vlasik had become an instructor himself. He taught others what he had learned, but more importantly, he refined the techniques through practical application. He trained NKVD special units, border guards, intelligence operatives. Men who would disappear into enemy territory and needed to kill silently, efficiently, without hesitation. Back in the forest, the second German soldier finally reacted. His hands fumbled with his rifle, trying to bring it to bear. But Vlasik was already moving, using the corporal's corpse as a battering ram, shoving it into the second soldier. The body hit with enough force to knock the German backward. Vlasik released the corpse and closed the distance in one explosive step. His hand, rigid as steel, drove into the soldier's face. The ridge of his palm struck the bridge of the nose with devastating force. Bone fragments drove upward into the brain. The soldier died before his body understood it should fall. Vlasik caught the rifle as it dropped, spinning it in his hands with practiced ease. The third German had his weapon halfway raised. Vlasik swung the rifle like a club, the wooden stock connecting with the soldier's jaw. Teeth shattered. The jawbone separated from the skull with a wet cracking sound. Every movement flowed into the next with terrible grace. No wasted motion, No hesitation, no mercy. This wasn't combat, it was execution. A master craftsman demonstrating his art on living canvas. The training from Leningrad had prepared him for exactly this. Overwhelming violence delivered with surgical precision, transforming a desperate situation into a killing ground. Vlasik's mind remained eerily calm, even as his body moved through the choreography of death. He counted opponents, tracked positions, calculated angles of fire. Part of him observed the fight from outside, noting mistakes he would correct in future training, techniques that worked better than expected, adaptations forced by circumstances. This detachment, this ability to remain analytical while killing, separated true professionals from mere fighters. The Germans were brave, well-trained soldiers, but they had never faced anything like this. The fourth German soldier stood directly behind Vlasik, frozen in shock at the speed of carnage unfolding before his eyes. His hands gripped his rifle, but his brain hadn't yet sent the command to raise it, to aim, to fire. That hesitation cost him his life. Vlasik reversed his grip on the captured Mauser, holding it like a spear, and drove the bayonet backward without looking. The blade punched through the soldier's ribcage, slicing between bones with the precision of a surgeon's scalpel. The steel found the heart. The German gasped, blood flooding his lungs, and collapsed. Vlasik yanked the bayonet free and spun to face the remaining four. The sergeant finally understood what was happening. His hand clawed for the Walther pistol at his belt, fingers fumbling with the holster flap. Too slow. Vlasik hurled the rifle like a javelin. The weapon flew straight and true, the bayonet piercing the sergeant's chest, driving through sternum and spine. The sergeant staggered backward, hands grasping uselessly at the rifle protruding from his body, and fell. 6 down. 2 seconds had passed since the fight began. The remaining 3 Germans finally reacted with trained instinct. They spread out, creating distance, bringing their weapons to bear. One dropped to one knee for a stable shooting position. Another backed toward a tree for cover. The third, the most experienced, simply raised his rifle and fired. The bullet cracked past Vlasik's head, so close he felt the displacement of air. He was already diving, rolling behind a thick oak trunk as more shots rang out. Bark exploded in splinters. Bullets thudded into wood. Vlasik's hand found the Walther pistol, yanking it free from the dead sergeant's holster as he rolled past the corpse. He came up in a crouch, the pistol steady in his hand. Training took over. Breathe, focus. The front sight, not the target. Let the target blur. Squeeze, don't pull. The first German was still on one knee, working the bolt of his Mauser. Vlasik fired once. The 9mm round entered just above the German's left eye, snapping his head back. The body toppled sideways, finger tightening reflexively on the trigger, sending a final shot harmlessly into the ground. The second German had reached the tree, using it as cover, only his head and rifle visible. A difficult shot. Vlasik aimed at the tree trunk itself, slightly to the left of where the German's face appeared. He fired twice. The bullets punched through the bark. One missed, one didn't. The German's face disappeared, replaced by red mist. His body slumped against the tree, sliding down slowly, leaving a dark smear on the bark. The last German broke. Terror overwhelmed training. He turned and ran, crashing through the undergrowth, abandoning weapon and comrades. Vlasik pursued without thought, his body responding to prey flight with predator instinct. The German was young, perhaps 19 or 20, and fear gave him speed. But Vlasik had been training for this since before the boy was born. He closed the distance in seconds, launching himself at the fleeing soldier in a tackle that brought both men crashing to the ground. They rolled together through dead leaves and mud. The German thrashed, screaming in terror, hands reaching for Vlasik's face, trying to claw at his eyes. Amateur movements, panic responses. Vlasik caught one wrist, twisted it behind the German's back, driving the arm up until the shoulder joint dislocated with a wet pop. The German shrieked. Vlasik's other hand closed around his throat from behind, fingers finding the carotid arteries, thumb pressing into the windpipe. Not a choke, but a stranglehold. The German's free hand beat uselessly at Vlasik's arm, nails scratching skin, drawing blood. It made no difference. Vlasik maintained pressure, counting seconds. 5, 6, 7. The struggles weakened. 8, 9. The body went limp. 10, 11, 12. Vlasik held the pressure for another 5 seconds, ensuring brain death, then released. The German's body settled into the leaves, eyes open and unseeing. Silence descended on the forest. Vlasik remained crouched over the corpse, breathing hard, adrenaline still flooding his system. His hands trembled slightly, not from fear, but from the aftermath of explosive violence, the body's chemical response to mortal combat. He forced himself to breathe slowly, deeply, bringing his heart rate down. The fight had lasted less than 1 minute from first strike to final kill. 8 armed soldiers eliminated by an unarmed, starving man. Proof that the system worked. That years of training could overcome any odds. That proper preparation was more valuable than weapons, numbers, or physical strength. Vlasik stood slowly, his legs shaking from exhaustion and spent adrenaline. The wound on his shoulder burned where a bullet had grazed him during the firefight. Minor. He'd had worse in training. He walked back through the killing ground, examining each body with professional detachment. All dead. No wounded, no survivors. Clean work, efficient, exactly as he'd been trained. The instructors in Leningrad would have approved. He began gathering supplies. The Germans carried food, hard black bread, sausage, chocolate. Vlasik's stomach cramped at the sight of it. But he forced himself to eat slowly, methodically. Too much food too fast after days of starvation would make him sick. He needed strength, not vomiting. Water from the soldiers' canteens tasted like heaven. He drank carefully, rationing himself, knowing he needed to save some for the journey ahead. Weapons next. He selected a Mauser rifle, checking the action, ensuring it functioned properly. Ammunition from the dead soldiers' pouches, as much as he could carry. The Walther pistol went into his belt. A trench knife from one corpse, good for silent work. A German greatcoat still warm from its previous owner's body. He stripped it off the sergeant, ignoring the blood, and wrapped it around himself. The coat would serve dual purpose, warmth and disguise. From a distance, he might pass for a German soldier. Close inspection would reveal the deception, but distance was all he needed. A map from the sergeant's pocket marked with patrol routes and German positions. Intelligence gold. His own command would pay dearly for this information if he could get it back to Soviet lines. He studied the map, orienting himself, plotting a route east. 60, maybe 70 kilometers to Soviet positions. Through occupied territory, past German patrols, across rivers and roads. A week of careful travel if he was lucky. Longer if circumstances forced delays. He could do it. He had the skills, the supplies, the motivation. Failure meant death, and he hadn't survived this long to die stupidly. Vlasik took one final look at the 8 corpses scattered through the clearing. Young men, most of them. Soldiers following orders, doing their duty as they understood it. In another world, another time, he might have felt something for them. Pity, perhaps. Regret. But this wasn't another world. This was war. They would have killed him without hesitation, would have laughed while doing it. Their mistake was underestimating him, seeing exhaustion instead of preparation, weakness instead of deadly competence. That mistake had cost them everything. He turned east and began walking, moving through the forest with the fluid grace of a predator in familiar territory. The German patrol wouldn't be missed for hours yet. By the time their commanders realized something had gone wrong, Vlasik would be kilometers away, a ghost moving through enemy territory. Behind him, the forest began to reclaim the dead. Night fell quickly in the October forest, darkness arriving like a heavy curtain dropping across the world. Vlasik moved through shadows, using every scrap of cover, every dip in terrain, every cluster of trees. The German greatcoat helped conceal his silhouette, breaking up his outline against the forest backdrop. He traveled only at night now, hiding during daylight hours in dense thickets or abandoned buildings. The first 3 nights passed without incident. He covered perhaps 15 kilometers, moving slowly, carefully, stopping frequently to listen. The forest at night was alive with sounds. Wind through branches, small animals rustling through undergrowth, distant artillery rumbling like approaching thunder. He learned to distinguish natural sounds from human ones, the crack of a twig under a boot from the snap of a breaking branch. On the 4th night, he encountered other Soviet soldiers, 5 men, haggard and desperate, hiding in a ravine. They watched him approach with rifles raised, eyes hollow with suspicion. In October 1941, trust was a luxury no one could afford. Too many Red Army soldiers had put on German uniforms, too many collaborators hunted their former comrades for German favor. Vlasik identified himself carefully, providing unit designation, commanding officer's name, details only a real Soviet officer would know. The men remained wary, but eventually lowered their weapons. They shared what little food they had, thin soup made from tree bark and questionable mushrooms. Vlasik contributed some of his captured German rations. The bread and sausage disappeared in minutes, 5 starving men devouring it with animal desperation. Their leader, a junior sergeant named Petrov, explained their situation. They'd been cut off during the encirclement near Vyazma, watched their regiment destroyed, fled into the forests. 2 weeks of running, hiding, slowly starving. They had no plan beyond survival, no idea how to reach Soviet lines, no hope beyond living another day. Vlasik studied them in the firelight, evaluating their condition. Petrov was the strongest, still capable of fighting. 2 others were wounded but mobile. The last 2 were on the edge of collapse, exhaustion, and hunger, reducing them to shambling ghosts. He made a decision. Alone, he could move faster, had better chances. But these men deserved a chance too. They'd fought, they'd survived, they'd kept faith. He would lead them out or die trying. He explained his plan using the captured German map. They would move northeast, avoiding major roads and German strongpoints, using rivers and marshland that the Wehrmacht avoided. The swamps were treacherous, cold, miserable, but German patrols rarely ventured into them. The men listened, hope kindling in their eyes for the first time in weeks. At dawn, they moved out. Vlasik led, setting a pace the weakest could maintain. They traveled for 2 hours, then rested for 30 minutes. During rest stops, Vlasik taught them techniques for moving silently, for reading terrain, for spotting ambushes. Basic survival skills that might keep them alive. The sergeant's military training combined with practical experience created lessons they absorbed desperately. On the 6th day, they encountered a German supply convoy. 3 trucks moving slowly along a forest road, escorted by a dozen soldiers. Vlasik studied them from concealment, calculating odds. The smart move was to hide, let them pass. But the trucks carried food, medical supplies, ammunition. resources his group desperately needed, resources that could mean the difference between survival and death. He organized an ambush, positioning his men in the trees along the roadside. Petrov and the two strongest would fire on the escorts. The wounded men would target truck drivers. Vlasik himself would handle close combat if any Germans broke through the firing line. They waited in silence as the convoy approached. Vlasik's hand signal, now. Rifles cracked in ragged volley. 2 Germans fell immediately. The others scattered, seeking cover, returning fire. Bullets ripped through leaves and branches. One of Vlasik's men cried out, hit in the leg. The convoy halted, soldiers taking defensive positions. This wasn't going as planned. The Germans were professionals, reacting with trained efficiency rather than panic. Vlasik saw the situation deteriorating, made another quick decision. He charged from concealment, the Mauser rifle in his hands, firing as he ran. He shot the nearest German through the chest, worked the bolt, shot another. Close now, too close for rifles. He dropped the Mauser, pulled the trench knife, and went to work. The blade found a throat, then another. German soldiers tried to bring weapons to bear, but he was among them now, inside their firing lines, turning their numbers into a disadvantage. They couldn't shoot without hitting each other. His knife painted red arcs through the air. His free hand struck with palm heel strikes, elbow smashes, knee strikes to vulnerable points. Everything he'd learned in Leningrad, every technique drilled into muscle memory, he used now with savage efficiency. A German rushed him with a bayonet. Vlasik sidestepped, caught the rifle, twisted it from the soldier's grasp, and drove the German's own bayonet through his stomach. Another soldier swung a rifle butt at his head. Vlasik ducked under it, drove his knife up under the German's ribs, angling for the heart. The soldier gasped, eyes wide with shock, and fell. The fight ended as suddenly as it began. 12 Germans lay dead or dying. 2 of Vlasik's men were wounded, but alive. The trucks were theirs. They loaded quickly, taking everything useful: food, medical supplies, blankets, ammunition. 1 truck still ran. Petrov knew how to drive. They piled in, abandoning stealth for speed, racing down the forest road before German reinforcements could arrive. 5 kilometers, 10, 15. They abandoned the truck when fuel ran low, disappearing back into the forest with their plunder. That night, they ate well for the first time in weeks. They bandaged wounds with real medical supplies. They slept under German blankets, almost warm. Morale transformed. They were no longer refugees fleeing in terror. They were soldiers, fighting back, taking the war to the enemy. Vlasik had given them something more valuable than food or supplies. He'd given them purpose, direction, hope. The journey continued. November brought cold rain that turned to sleet, then snow. The group lost 1 man to infection from his wounds, another to exposure during a particularly brutal night. 3 remained with Vlasik as they pushed toward Soviet lines. In late November, they reached the front. They approached carefully, signaling with captured German flares in a pattern Vlasik hoped Soviet forces would recognize. A tense hour passed before a Soviet patrol emerged from positions, weapons ready. More interrogation, more suspicion, more verification, but eventually, acceptance. They were home. Vlasik had led them through 70 kilometers of occupied territory, through ambushes and firefights, through cold and hunger and despair. 4 men survived out of 8. Not perfect, but good enough. They'd made it. Against impossible odds, they'd survived. The hospital in the rear smelled of antiseptic and death. Vlasik lay in a narrow bed, his body slowly recovering from months of starvation and exposure. Doctors marveled that he'd survived at all. His weight had dropped to 52 kilograms, his body consuming its own muscle for fuel. Frostbite had claimed 2 toes on his left foot. The bullet graze on his shoulder had infected, requiring surgical debridement. But he was alive, and his mind remained sharp. That was what mattered. The NKVD interrogators came on the 3rd day. Standard procedure for anyone who'd been behind enemy lines, who'd escaped from encirclement. Suspicion was default policy in 1942. Too many real traitors. Too many German agents wearing Soviet uniforms. Too much at stake to trust anyone without verification. Vlasik told his story without embellishment. The encirclement near Vyazma, the encounter with the German patrol, the fight in the forest. 8 enemies killed in less than 1 minute. The interrogators exchanged glances. Possible, perhaps, but barely believable. They questioned Petrov and the other survivors separately, comparing accounts, looking for inconsistencies. The stories matched. Every detail aligned. The physical evidence supported the claims. Captured German weapons, maps, documents. Intelligence officers studied the marked German positions, finding them accurate, valuable. Slowly, grudgingly, the interrogators accepted the truth. Vlasik was genuine. More than that, he was exceptional. In April 1942, he received orders to report to Moscow, to NKVD headquarters on Lubyanka Square. The building loomed dark and forbidding, its reputation preceding it. Inside, he met with senior officers who studied him with calculating eyes. They explained what they needed. The war was going badly. The Wehrmacht was winning through superior training, better tactics, more effective small unit leadership. Soviet forces needed to match that, to exceed it. They needed soldiers who could operate independently behind enemy lines, who could survive in impossible conditions, who could kill efficiently with any weapon or no weapon at all. They needed men like Vlasik, thousands of them. He was given the rank of major and assigned to create a training school. A facility in Mytishchi, north of Moscow, a former sports camp converted to military use. He had complete authority to design curriculum, select instructors, establish standards. The only requirement, produce results. Vlasik threw himself into the work with fierce dedication. He recruited instructors from Spetsnaz units, from reconnaissance battalions, from anywhere he could find men with real combat experience. No theorists, no parade ground soldiers. Only men who'd killed enemies with their hands, who'd survived behind enemy lines, who understood that training had to reflect reality or it was worthless. The first class arrived in May. 200 men selected from thousands of volunteers. Vlasik evaluated them personally, looking for specific qualities. Physical strength mattered less than endurance. Speed mattered less than tactical thinking. Size mattered not at all compared to determination. He wanted men who wouldn't quit, who could function under extreme stress, who possessed the cold mental clarity necessary for violence. The training program he designed was brutal by peacetime standards. But this wasn't peacetime. Students spent weeks in forests without food, learning to hunt, to trap, to identify edible plants. They were dropped in mountains in winter with minimal equipment and ordered to survive. They were bound and thrown into water, forced to free themselves and swim to shore. They were attacked without warning in the middle of the night, testing reactions and ability to fight while disoriented. Hand-to-hand combat formed the core of instruction. Vlasik taught them what he'd learned from Spiridonov, Oshepkov, and Kharlampiev, refined by his own combat experience. Not sport techniques, but killing methods. Strikes to vital points: throat, temple, solar plexus, liver, kidneys. Bone breaks designed for maximum pain and minimum time. Ways to kill sentries silently, from behind, without allowing a sound. Every technique was drilled thousands of times until conscious thought disappeared, until the body responded faster than the mind could command. Students practiced on each other, pulling strikes at the last instant, learning control alongside lethality. Vlasik supplemented physical training with tactical instruction. How to read terrain, how to plan ambushes, how to exploit enemy weaknesses, how to use darkness, weather, terrain as weapons. How to think 3 moves ahead, anticipating enemy responses, always maintaining initiative. Psychological training addressed fear, not eliminating it, but controlling it, channeling it into heightened awareness rather than paralysis. Students learned to function despite exhaustion, despite pain, despite overwhelming odds. The mind could override the body if properly trained. The first class graduated in November 1942. 170 students completed the program. 30 had quit or been dismissed. The graduates were lean, hard men with cold eyes and complete confidence in their abilities. They deployed immediately to the front, joining reconnaissance units, partisan groups, special operations teams. Reports began filtering back within weeks. A team of Vlasik's graduates infiltrated German headquarters near Rzhev, killed 15 officers including a colonel, and escaped without casualties. Another group derailed 3 ammunition trains in 1 week using techniques learned in the sabotage course. A solo operative eliminated a German general using hand-to-hand combat methods, silently killing 4 guards before reaching his target. The success rate was undeniable. Graduates survived at rates 40% higher than conventional soldiers. They completed missions others considered impossible. They killed more enemies, gathered better intelligence, caused more disruption to German operations. By 1943, the school was training 500 students at a time, running continuous cycles, producing a steady stream of elite fighters. Vlasik personally supervised every class, maintaining standards, ensuring quality never declined in pursuit of quantity. He remembered Leningrad, remembered his own instructors, understood that mediocre training produced dead soldiers. Excellence was the only acceptable standard. In late 1943, he received the Order of the Red Banner for the forest fight. Recognition delayed by bureaucracy and suspicion, but finally acknowledged. In 1944, the Order of the Patriotic War, First Class, for creating the training program. Medals meant less than the letters from graduates. Thank you. Your lesson saved my life. Your training made the difference. I'm alive because you taught me. Those words mattered more than any decoration. The war ended in May 1945, but Vlasik's work continued. Victory didn't eliminate the need for special operations forces. If anything, the emerging Cold War required more sophisticated capabilities. He adapted curriculum for new realities: operations in Western Europe, urban combat, intelligence gathering in hostile territory. The fundamentals remained constant: survive, adapt, kill efficiently. Everything else was details. The post-war years brought reorganization and expansion. The training facility in Mytishchi grew from a single compound to a sprawling complex with specialized training areas. Urban warfare mock-ups, mountain terrain simulators, underwater combat facilities. Vlasik oversaw it all, his reputation growing within the intelligence community even as he remained unknown to the general public. By 1950, the school graduated over 1,000 operatives annually, feeding personnel into units scattered across the globe. Korea saw graduates operating behind enemy lines, disrupting supply routes, gathering intelligence. Eastern Europe deployed teams to counter Western intelligence operations, to identify and eliminate threats before they materialized. The techniques Vlasik had developed in that Smolensk forest, refined through years of teaching, now shaped operations across multiple continents. In 1953, Vlasik began his most important work, systematizing everything he knew into comprehensive written form. The resulting manual, titled Fundamentals of Survival and Hand-to-Hand Combat for Special Operations Personnel, ran to 400 pages. Classified as top secret, it was distributed only to officers commanding special units and to training instructors. The text was brutally practical, stripped of unnecessary theory or flowery language. Each technique was explained in precise anatomical terms. Which bones to break, which nerves to strike, which blood vessels to compress. Diagrams illustrated proper hand position, optimal striking angles, leverage points for maximum force with minimum effort. The psychological section addressed fear management, stress inoculation, decision-making under extreme conditions. How to maintain clarity when exhausted, wounded, surrounded. The manual became required reading for every special operations instructor in Soviet military and intelligence services. It was updated every 5 years, incorporating lessons from new conflicts, new environments, new tactical situations. But the core principles remained unchanged. Efficiency over style, speed over strength, psychology over physicality, will to survive above everything else. Graduates of Vlasik's school operated in Afghanistan before the official intervention, mapping terrain, establishing contacts with local populations, preparing infrastructure for future operations. They worked in Vietnam's jungles, training North Vietnamese commandos in infiltration and sabotage techniques. They operated in African deserts, supporting liberation movements, teaching guerrilla warfare to local fighters. In European cities, they conducted surveillance, recruited assets, eliminated threats. Every operation applied methods Vlasik had developed or refined. The quiet knife in darkness, the silent approach, the calculated violence that left no witnesses. His influence spread far beyond the men he'd personally trained. His students became instructors who trained new generations, creating branches of expertise while maintaining fundamental principles. By 1960, Vlasik held the rank of colonel, but age was taking its toll. At 54, he could still demonstrate most techniques, could still push younger men harder than they thought possible, but his body remembered every old injury, every frostbitten extremity, every infection from that terrible winter of 1941 to 1942. His knees ached constantly. His shoulder, where the German bullet had grazed, predicted rain better than any weatherman. He understood his time as active instructor was ending. The transition came gradually. He shifted from hands-on teaching to curriculum development, from demonstrating techniques to evaluating instructors, from direct training to strategic planning. His best students had become masters themselves, spreading across the Soviet Special Operations community, each developing their own specializations while maintaining the foundations Vlasik had established. Major Sokolov specialized in mountain warfare, training units for operations in Afghanistan and Caucasus regions. Captain Petrov, yes, the same sergeant he'd led out of encirclement, now commanded an urban operations school, teaching building clearance and hostage rescue. Colonel Orlov focused on psychological operations, expanding the mental conditioning components of training. Each brought unique insights, but all traced their expertise back to Vlasik's teaching. In 1965, Vlasik retired from active service. The ceremony was small, private, attended only by senior intelligence officers and former students who'd achieved command positions. They presented him with formal awards, made formal speeches about his contributions. He accepted with characteristic silence, uncomfortable with praise. viewing everything he'd done as simply duty performed. What mattered wasn't recognition, but continuation. His work would outlive him through the thousands he'd trained, through the systems he'd created, through the manual that would guide future generations. Retirement meant a small Moscow apartment near Gorky Park, where he maintained daily exercise routines despite aging joints and diminishing flexibility. Every morning at dawn, he performed the same drills he'd learned in Leningrad 40 years earlier. His body no longer responded with youthful speed, but muscle memory persisted, movements ingrained too deeply to forget. Former students visited regularly. Generals now, commanding special forces brigades, intelligence directorates, counter-terrorism units. They sought advice on tactical problems, shared stories of recent operations, asked him to review new training protocols. Vlasik listened more than he spoke, his input concise and practical. One recommendation could reshape entire programs because his experience was unmatched, his judgment proven across decades. In 1970, a military journalist requested an interview for a classified publication documenting special operations history. Vlasik refused. His work wasn't heroic narrative material. It was professional violence, systematic killing, deliberate cultivation of lethal skills. Nothing to celebrate publicly, even if necessary for national defense. He made one exception: a brief contribution to an internal memoir collection circulated only among special operations veterans. 3 pages describing October 1941. 8 German soldiers, 1 minute of combat. Written in report language, emotionless and factual. Just the sequence of events, the techniques employed, the outcome. But for those who read it, those 3 pages meant more than any heroic account. They proved the system worked, that training could overcome impossible odds, that a properly prepared man could achieve what seemed superhuman. The story became legend within Spetsnaz community, told to new recruits as inspiration and instruction. Not mythology about invincible warriors, but truth about what proper training made possible. Vlasik's final years passed quietly in his Moscow apartment, a small space filled with books and memories, but little else. He lived simply, his needs minimal after decades of military discipline. Each morning, regardless of weather, he walked to Gorky Park and performed stretching exercises under ancient trees. His body was failing, 70 years of hard use exacting inevitable price, but routine remained sacred. Other elderly men in the park sometimes watched curiously as he moved through strange positions, slow-motion strikes, and defensive postures that made no sense to untrained eyes. They assumed he practiced some exotic Eastern discipline, never imagining the old man had trained thousands of the Soviet Union's most dangerous operatives. He never corrected their assumptions. Anonymity suited him perfectly. Former students continued visiting until the end. Lieutenant General Sokolov came monthly, bringing reports from Afghanistan where Soviet special forces operated in mountain terrain using techniques Vlasik had developed. Colonel Petrov, now heading urban warfare instruction, sought advice on adapting methods for hostage rescue situations. They spoke in technical terms, discussing leverage points and tactical timing, old master and accomplished students refining their shared craft. Vlasik offered sparse commentary, but when he spoke, they listened with absolute attention. A single word from him could redirect entire training programs because his understanding ran deeper than theory, rooted in survival experience no book could teach. In 1976, his health declined sharply. Pneumonia, complicated by damage from that terrible winter behind German lines 35 years earlier. He refused hospitalization initially. Stubborn independence, resisting institutional care. But eventually, weakness forced capitulation. The military hospital in Moscow treated him with respect bordering on reverence once staff realized who occupied the bed. Nurses whispered about the old colonel whose training manual remained required reading, whose techniques had saved countless lives. Doctors marveled that he'd survived so long given the accumulated damage documented in his medical file. Frostbite, bullet wounds, knife scars, broken bones poorly healed. His body was a map of violence endured and inflicted. He died quietly in spring 1977, slipping away during the night without drama or struggle. The funeral was military honors, closed to public, attended only by intelligence community members cleared for presence. They buried him in a cemetery reserved for security services personnel, his gravestone marked with name, rank, dates, nothing more. No mention of accomplishments, no listing of awards. Just another colonel among thousands. Exactly as he would have wanted. But within Special Operations community, his death marked an era's end. The last of the original generation, the men who'd built Soviet special warfare capability from nothing. Obituaries in classified military journals detailed his contributions, though even these understated the full scope of his influence. The manual he'd written continued governing training decades after his death, updated periodically with new techniques and technologies, but core principles remained untouched. Efficiency, speed, psychology, will. Everything else was implementation detail. His methods spread beyond Soviet borders through various channels. Graduates who trained under him or his direct students carried knowledge to allied nations: Cuba, Vietnam, North Korea, various African and Middle Eastern countries. They taught local forces, adapted techniques to different cultural contexts, but maintained fundamental approaches. The quiet kill, the unexpected strike, the transformation of weakness into strength. By the 1980s, variations of Vlasik's system existed in special forces units worldwide, often unattributed, absorbed into local martial traditions, but recognizable to trained eyes. A particular knife technique, a specific joint lock, a psychological preparation method. These fingerprints revealed lineage back to that Moscow training facility, back to Vlasik's systematic brutality. The Soviet Union collapsed in 1991, but the training infrastructure survived transition. New Russian special forces, Spetsnaz units operating in Chechnya and other conflict zones, still learned from Vlasik's manual, still practiced techniques he'd codified 50 years earlier. The organizational names changed, political context transformed, but operational requirements remained constant. Men still needed to kill efficiently, survive impossible situations, function beyond normal human limits. The methods Vlasik developed still accomplished those objectives better than alternatives. Modern instructors studied his work, impressed by its timelessness. Technology evolved, weapons advanced, but human anatomy hadn't changed. The vulnerable points he'd identified remained vulnerable. The psychological principles he'd outlined still applied. Contemporary operators in Afghanistan, Syria, Ukraine, wherever Russian special forces deployed, applied techniques descended directly from Vlasik's teaching. They probably didn't know his name. The system had been absorbed, institutionalized, attributed to various later figures who'd built on his foundation. But the DNA was his. That Smolensk forest in October 1941 had birthed a legacy extending across continents and generations. 8 German soldiers had made a fatal error that day, mistaking preparation for weakness, seeing exhaustion instead of deadly competence. Their mistake became a teaching moment that echoed through 80 years of special operations training. Every instructor telling that story to new recruits made the same point. Never underestimate a properly trained opponent. Physical appearance means nothing. Size means nothing. Apparent weakness might be calculated deception. The man swaying on his feet might be the most dangerous person in the forest. In the 21st century, mixed martial arts competitions sometimes featured techniques traceable to Vlasik's system, filtered through various intermediaries, modified for sport contexts, but recognizable in fundamental structure. Fighters who trained in Russian military systems brought knowledge into civilian spheres, teaching what they'd learned without necessarily understanding full historical context. The legacy dispersed, fragmented, but persisted. Vlasik would have been grimly amused by the irony. His work, designed for killing, now taught in gymnasiums for fitness and sport. But perhaps he would have appreciated the underlying truth that his methods worked regardless of application, that proper biomechanics and psychological preparation yielded results, whether in combat or competition. The story of 8 Germans and 1 Soviet officer became legend within military special operations community worldwide. Details varied in different tellings, embellished or simplified depending on audience and purpose. But core narrative remained consistent. Outnumbered, outgunned, exhausted man defeats superior force through training, technique, will. Not superhuman strength, not miraculous intervention, but systematic application of learned skills under extreme pressure. The ultimate validation of rigorous preparation. If you found this story of incredible determination, professional mastery, and enduring legacy compelling, please like this video and subscribe to the channel. Share in the comments. What do you believe matters more in critical situations, physical strength or proper training? Do you know other examples where skill overcame numbers? Thank you for watching until the end. You are the best audience. Until next time.